So let's talk about cellular respiration. So there's only a couple of syllabus objectives here for cellular respiration. So we've got to remember that we don't need to know it in any massive detail. It's very easy to fall down a rabbit hole of looking at this in a lot of detail, but we don't need that. We need to be able to describe aerobic respiration in terms of the three main steps: glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. We need to know the overall reaction. We need to be able to touch on anaerobic respiration by comparing aerobic and anaerobic. So let's get into it. So first of all, aerobic respiration, aerobic means with oxygen. So it's that process of converting glucose into energy in the presence of oxygen, and it produces carbon dioxide and water as the byproducts. So the overall reaction, if you have a look at words, first of all, we've got glucose plus oxygen, and that produces carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And that energy is in the form of ATP. So the balanced equation, this is the formula for glucose, C6H12O6, and then we have 6 oxygens producing 6 CO2, 6 H2O, and up to 38 ATP. It's often not as efficient as that, but it is quite a large amount of ATP. So let's have a basic look at the process of the 3-step process of aerobic respiration. First of all, in the cytoplasm, we have glycolysis. So the input here is glucose, the 6-carbon sugar, and glycolysis means glucose splitting. So we split that 6-carbon sugar into 2 3-carbon sugars. That process releases a little bit of ATP and releases these high-energy electrons and hydrogen ions, and they get carried by this NAD down to the electron transport chain. The product of glycolysis, that 3-carbon sugar, then goes down to the Krebs cycle, really complex process that we don't need to know the details, and this occurs in the matrix, or the inner part of the mitochondrion. And every turn of the Krebs cycle produces carbon dioxide, and it produces some more ATP. But more importantly, produces more of these high energy electrons and hydrogen ions that get transported down to the electron transport chain, where they're actually going to do work. So the electron transport chain is across the inner membrane called the cristae. And essentially, the high energy electrons are used to provide the energy to pump those hydrogen ions across the membrane to produce a concentration gradient. As they come back down through the membrane, passively, they're actually going through ATP synthase and producing ATP. At the end of it, we have these high energy electrons and hydrogen ions that need to be mopped up, and they're mopped up by oxygen to form water. Then the NAD, that high energy electron carrier, goes back to the beginning, so it can participate in the next processes of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So I've just broken down each of these into a little bit more detail. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. It's about splitting glucose into 2 3-carbon sugars, which we call pyruvate. A little bit of ATP, and we've got these high energy electrons that are carried to the electron transport chain. And I've just given you a little diagram down here. So NAD plus is the actual carrier, and it carries hydrogen ions and high energy electrons. So they are both used in the electron transport chain. And the Krebs cycle occurs in the matrix, which is this innermost part of the mitochondrion. Again, a little bit more ATP produced. This is where the carbon dioxide is produced as one of the products of cellular respiration. And again, more high energy electrons and hydrogen ions are carried to the electron transport chain. And then finally, the electron transport chain. This is where we get so much of the ATP. So the glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, they're all setting up those conditions for the electron transport chain. So essentially what happens is we've got the high energy electrons provide the power to pump hydrogen ions across the cristae, creating a concentration gradient. When the hydrogen ions diffuse back through, they turn ATP synthase to actually synthesize ATP. I'm going to show you that in a diagram in just a second. But we've got oxygen that then comes in to mop up those hydrogen ions and the electrons, and that's what forms water, the final output of cellular respiration. So if we just have a look at a diagram across this inner membrane, we can see that we've got the high energy electrons that are being used to pump hydrogen ions across the membrane to produce a concentration gradient. And then those hydrogen ions then passively diffuse back through, and they go through ATP synthase. And so that's the enzyme that synthesizes ATP. So aerobic respiration requires the oxygen, and the reason it requires oxygen is to grab those hydrogens right at the end, allowing the NAD to go back to, start the process again. So when there's no oxygen, cellular respiration can't progress past the first process of glycolysis. So let's talk about anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic is when there's no oxygen. So we can do glycolysis in the cytoplasm, but it can't progress past that because there's no oxygen to be able to mop up the high energy electrons and the hydrogen ions. So glycolysis, as you know, we produce 2 ATP, and we also produce the high energy electrons and the hydrogen ions, which are received by NADH. But we need to free up this NAD for glycolysis to then continue. So we need, given there's no oxygen to mop up the hydrogen and the electrons, we need another way of regenerating the NAD. So in animals and bacteria, NAD donates the hydrogen ions and electrons to pyruvate, and that forms lactic acid. So we've produced our ATP, glycolysis produces the 2 pyruvates, and we have obviously produced the NADH, but the NADH donates the hydrogens and the electrons to pyruvate, and that forms lactate or lactic acid, which I'm sure you've heard of in terms of muscles producing lactic acid in anaerobic exercise. It also happens in bacteria as well. And in plants, we have alcohol fermentation. So the NADH donates the hydrogen ions and the electrons to pyruvate. There is another intermediate step here, but we're not going to worry about that. Donates to pyruvate, forming ethanol, alcohol, producing carbon dioxide, and importantly, regenerating the NAD plus for glycolysis to continue. So just finally, the syllabus objective about anaerobic respiration was asking to compare aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So when we're doing comparing, it's a similarity, a difference, and a significance. So the similarity is that they both involve glycolysis, and they both involve glucose, and they both release ATP, and they also both release the high energy electrons and the hydrogen. The difference is that aerobic respiration involves oxygen and anaerobic respiration does not. So because aerobic respiration involves oxygen, it's allowed to progress through the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain because it's got the oxygen to be able to mop up the hydrogens and the electrons. It's called the final electron acceptor. Whereas anaerobic respiration does not have oxygen, so it can't progress past glycolysis. So the significance then is that aerobic respiration produces far more ATP, 36 to 38 ATP, compared with 2 ATP from anaerobic respiration.